My name is Selen Ercan, and I'm an associate professor here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra in Australia. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. This event is hosted by our center, and it's anchored on our Deliberative Integrity project, which is funded by the Australian Research Council and which aims to examine what it means to run an ethical mini-public. It's great to see so many people joining us tonight in Australia, today, early morning in some parts of Europe. It's great to see both new friends, old friends, faces. Lovely to see everyone tonight. I would like to remind everyone that this event will be recorded, and I hope that this is fine with you. This has been a pretty standard practice in post-COVID times. So tonight we have 2 speakers and 3 discussants. We will start with the speakers of the event, Claudia Chwalisz and Ieva Cesnulaityte. They are both from the OECD and they worked on the report, which is going to be launched in a minute. I would like to briefly introduce our speakers and then invite them to start their presentation, and they will have around 30 minutes to present the key points, key findings of the both reports. Claudia Chwalisz is a world-leading expert on deliberative democracy and democratic innovations. She established and has been leading the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation since 2018, and she is the co-author of the OECD's flagship report, Catching the Deliberative Wave, with Ieva Cesnulaityte. Ieva has been working closely with Claudia from OECD as well, and additionally authoring the recent report of the OECD on Evaluation Guidelines for Representative Deliberative Processes. I would like to welcome you both to tonight's event, Claudia and Ieva. Claudia, it's lovely to see you again. Claudia was a visitor at our center before our worlds changed because of the COVID. So it's lovely to see you again, Claudia, and it's lovely to meet you, Ieva. It's over to you for 30 minutes to present the key findings of your reports.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Selen, for this introduction, and thanks to you and to Nicole Curato and to the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra for co-hosting this event with us at the OECD. It's a great pleasure to see you, to see so many familiar faces, but also to see lots of new faces and new names. So really looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to share my screen with a few slides. Let me just get that up. There we go. So I'm going to, I know for some of you this is going to be old news, but I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to make sure we're all on the same page of what we're talking about when I say representative deliberative processes, give a snapshot of the OECD's bigger picture work on deliberative democracy these past years, but I'll very quickly dive into the findings from the new paper that I've written on 8 ways to institutionalize deliberative democracy, and will hand over to my colleague Ieva, who will go over the details around the new evaluation guidelines that we have published recently. So first, before getting into the details, what do we mean by a representative deliberative process, which I admit is a bit of a mouthful of a term. So here we're talking quite specifically about the sorts of processes where a public authority begins with a public problem that they need to solve. In order to do so, they convene a small, broadly representative group of everyday people. So this is what is usually referred to as a citizens' assembly, a citizens' jury, a consensus conference, or so on. And they bring these people together through a pretty specific way, through a civic lottery or a sortition process. So this refers to a very large number of invitations going out completely at random in the first instance. So this varies, but it's often between 2,000 to 30,000 invitations going out to people people, inviting them to be part of this process to solve the public problem. And the people who receive this invitation have an option to opt in to the lottery. And amongst everybody who volunteers and says, yes, I would like to be part of this citizens' assembly, there is then a second random selection lottery stage that's done, but this time stratifying to control for that final group to be broadly representative of the population according to certain criteria. So usually this is things like gender, age, geography, and socioeconomic status, but sometimes there are additional criteria as well. So once that broadly representative group of people is convened, they go through broadly 3 stages of first orientation and learning, to hear from experts, to hear from stakeholders, to better understand the complexity of the issue that they're being asked to propose solutions for. They deliberate, meaning that they weigh this evidence, and they also try to find common ground on where they agree on some recommendations, which they draft for the public authority. And the process doesn't end there, but with the response from the public authority to the citizens' assembly. So this is what we are talking about when we're talking about representative deliberative processes, quite specific, and in the OECD context, very much within the sphere of policymaking. So over the past 3 years, we've published these various publications that are up here, and what we've called now the Deliberative Democracy Toolbox. First, the Catching the Deliberative Wave report, which came out in June 2020, off the back of around 300 examples of these sorts of processes that we had collected across all levels of government. Off the back of that, we developed the good practice principles for deliberative processes. And now more recently, we've published the evaluation guidelines and the 8 ways to institutionalize deliberative democracy paper. This first key flagship report, everything we've done and we'll talk about today sort of builds on it. So I just say that it has close to 300 examples from 18 different countries, all levels of government. And off of the back of this, we identified 12 models of deliberative processes. So distinguishing between citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries, consensus conferences, planning cells, and so on, and developed the 11 principles of good practice. This is just a rough snapshot of this data to give you a sense of the momentum that has been building really since 2010. And we also more recently published an update to this database in November 2021. So what I'm showing here is a graph of the newer data that we have, where we had also collected new examples, both of processes that had taken place since publication, but also new examples that had been brought to our attention because of our publication and that we had not come across in the initial wave of research. I'm not going to go into this, but I did want to just highlight that the good practice principles are kind of at the core almost of everything we're doing now, because even when it comes to institutionalization, these principles are still at the heart of the considerations for how to go about this. And even more so when it comes to evaluation. In many ways, the evaluation guidelines operationalize these principles that step further. So we can go into this in the discussion if you would like, but I did want to just highlight that. So now this new paper that came out in December outlines 8 different models for institutionalizing representative public deliberation, arguments why to do this, but also the different considerations for implementation. So why would we want to institutionalize in the first place? One is that by embedding public deliberation in such a way that it becomes a kind of normal part of the way certain types of public decisions are taken. It would allow public decision makers to be able to take more hard decisions better, given that these sorts of processes are particularly well suited to trying to solve the most difficult problems where in many ways politicians are somewhat stuck, especially around longer term impacts where the short term incentives of electoral cycles make it hard to act. Secondly is, I think, around the potential to enhance public trust. I mean, trust is one of those issues I feel like we talk about all the time, been declining for decades. I think it's I think we could say that the impact of having a one-off process is fairly limited when it comes to really strengthening the relationship and that trust between politicians and citizens and government and citizens in both directions. But I think it's with that regular practice of it that there's a potential really to have an impact on trust. And then the third is about making representative deliberative processes easier and less expensive. There's a lot of costs, both in terms of human resources, time and energy, but also money that go into these processes. And by not starting from scratch every single time, there's a huge potential to actually save a lot of those resources. And then finally, let us not forget that beyond those reasons, there's also a really important one that has to do with reinforcing democracy, because adding public deliberation through the civic lottery process, which touches a much larger proportion of the population, it means that we can extend the privilege of representation to a much larger group of people. There's academic evidence which shows that participation in such a process strengthens people's sense of agency. There's also a sense of it harnessing collective capacity, awakening a collective consciousness, this notion that we are connected to something that's bigger than ourselves. Work notably by John Gastel and his colleagues around the Citizens Initiative Review have also shown that over the longer term, there also can lead to increased levels of political efficacy, not just amongst the members of the process, but also the broader public. And I think that there's seeing people like me who are participating in such a complex public decision-making process can have a similar effect on those who are not directly involved, but are aware of the process. So being part of this institutionalization scales the positive impact that participation can have on people's perceptions of themselves, their own capabilities, their worthiness to participate, but by extension, how they view others. And this is again where I go back to that potential of really this being able to strengthen societal trust and cohesion. Here is an overview of the 8 different ways that we've outlined in the paper. And I should just say actually that this paper isn't very theoretical in many ways. It's rather descriptive, actually, kind of looking at what is happening. These are the different ways in which we have seen already public deliberation being institutionalized in different places in different ways, and describing the models and some of the considerations around them. I think that one of the main takeaways from doing this work was that actually there is no one right way to institutionalize. There's a certain consideration of the good practice principles, which is why I mentioned them earlier, but then there's many different ways in which they can be embedded and implanted into a policymaking cycle. So we don't have huge amounts of time. I'm not going to go into every single one of these examples right now, and also because I imagine that many of you will have at least looked at, if not fully read, the paper beforehand. So what I'm going to focus on in the time we have now is I'm going to go over a few of the perhaps lesser known examples, and also from different parts of the world, to give a little bit of a snapshot of these different ways, but also happy to go back to some of the ones I didn't talk about in particular during the discussion. So one of the most recent examples, and most exciting to me as someone who lives in Paris and was involved in designing this process as well, is the Paris Citizens Assembly. So this was voted on to be embedded in the internal regulation of the Paris City Council in October 2021. And it works in a way that the Citizens Assembly is now a core part of how the Paris Council functions. And it is composed of 100 people who are living in Paris, 16 years and over, so not necessarily French nationals, but anyone who's a resident. And they are selected for a 1-year mandate, which has a potential of being extended to 18 months, dependent on certain criteria. And these Citizens Assembly members have a number of different competencies. One is that they're able to submit current affair questions, or vœux, which kind of roughly translates as wishes, to the Paris Council. So these are both neither of these have legal consequences in the sense that there's no legal obligation for the Paris Council to act on them, but they're able to submit a question or a vote in the same way that Paris councillors are able to do so within their council. The Citizens' Assembly is also able to launch an evaluation mission of an existing public policy in Paris to see what impact it is having, how it is working. And they are also able to initiate a citizens' jury. So they are able to choose the issue and the topic that should be put to a citizens' jury. That citizens' jury submits its recommendations back to the Citizens' Assembly in the form of a local bill. And that local bill is then officially submitted by the Citizens' Assembly after its review to the Paris Council. And this is in the form directly of the bill itself. So it goes directly to be deliberated by the Paris City Council and voted on by them. And then finally, there's also a connection to Paris's participatory budgeting, which is very developed and has been going on for a very long time, concerns a significant amount of money. And it's up to the Citizens' Assembly now to decide on what should be the theme of the following year's participatory budget. So it actually has a fairly significant impact on the direction of investment decisions that are being taken around this. And the Citizens' Assembly meets in a plenary altogether at least twice a year, but they also have working group meetings at different intervals that are decided by the members themselves, and something which is quite new, and I think we will want to evaluate and see how this works, is that the members themselves choose which working groups that they want to be part of. And something that's quite important to note is that within this internal regulation, there's also a requirement for the Paris Council to respond at the time of submission of the local bill of the citizens' jury, but also 1 year later to see, to say like what progress and what implementation has actually been made. There's also an oversight committee and a full-time secretariat that is devoted to this. Paris also has a very significant team responsible for participation, so they're also quite involved in helping with this, which is why there's just the one full-time person devoted to this in the secretariat. Another example that we've seen of a different kind of form of institutionalization are deliberative committees that have been implemented in the 3 different Brussels parliaments. And so these are sort of a variation of a typical parliamentary committee in the sense of, instead of it just being the MPs that would be part of it related to the specific issue that they have competencies for, those 15 MPs work together with 45 residents of Brussels who are selected by a civic lottery. And this whole process can be initiated either by the MPs, but also as it can be citizen initiated. So at least 1,000 signatures are required for it to be considered then by the parliamentarians to set up a deliberative committee on the issue that has been brought forth. And so the committee members, so both the citizens and MPs, work collectively to develop their recommendations, and they are submitted to the Brussels Parliament afterwards. The MPs who are involved in that committee follow up on the recommendations within at least 6 months. And then there needs to be a response as well, where that deliberative committee is reconvened and the government and the Parliament are both obliged to respond to all of the recommendations. And as with Paris, there's also a secretariat and there's an oversight committee that are both also part of the governance structure of these processes. And another new example from another part of the world in Bogota, Colombia, is the Itinerant Citizens' Assembly, which is an interconnected series of citizens' assemblies, which are called chapters, so on the same policy issue, but on different parts of the policy cycle. So for instance, the example that I have up here is from the very first one that took place in October and then December 2021, where the first Citizens' Assembly members, they had a mandate to propose the objectives for addressing urban planning challenges. They were divided up into 6 commissions and they developed collective proposals, which they passed on not to the council, but to the next Citizens' Assembly. And so the second Citizens' Assembly, they had a mandate to develop policy recommendations which were linked to the objectives that first Citizens Assembly identified, and then collectively their recommendations will be passed on to the City Council. So this is also something that is quite new. As I mentioned, the dates of the last one were December 2021, so something to be watching for. To me at the moment it remains unclear if there's going to be a next one later on related to evaluation or so on. I know that was the idea, but something that we're looking into with great interest. And then a final example, also because, I mean, this is the Australian launch, so there are a few examples from Australia, but one of the most recent ones has to do with the Victoria Local Government Act. And I also wanted to highlight it because it represents a sort of different approach to institutionalization, that rather than institutionalization being about establishing these permanent or ongoing deliberative bodies, it can also go through them, it can also happen in such a way of embedding it into legislation or regulation. So here with the Victoria Local Government Act, this act establishes the fact that all local councils must engage the community through deliberative practices on at least on all 4 of these strategic documents. So the planning and financial management plan, the community vision, the council plan, and the financial plan. And within this act, it does say that the deliberative engagement practices must follow the characteristics of good design. So when it comes to clear scope and objectives, access to information, representativeness, impact, transparency through the process. And so I mentioned it in the paper, but Mosaic Lab has now really detailed their work with 11 councils around this. I'm sure there are many others who have also been doing this so far. Again, I think it's something that's interesting to watch. And this model also, I think, allows for a path towards continuous learning and improvement. I think it's also could lend itself to trying to change the culture within these councils, but also to really build up that deliberative infrastructure over the long term. And then the final thing I will end on before passing over to my colleague Ieva is, what are the considerations for implementation when it comes to institutionalization? So just as we have numerous considerations for running parliaments and running other democratic institutions, to embed public deliberation, it requires certain infrastructure to really be effective. So the first is sustainable political commitment, having bipartisan cross-party support, something that transcends traditional party politics, I think, is part of what will allow this to last beyond certain election cycles. Next, a self-governing and systemic approach that depoliticizes as many aspects as possible. So that's where having secretariats and oversight bodies that are responsible for evaluation with no political scores to win or anything like that really matters as well. Afterwards, having measures to enable sustainable involvement of the public. So things like perhaps having an infrastructure for the alumni of these processes, ensuring there's really good public communication. Something that we're trying to push for a bit more is ensuring that there's actually paid leave from work to be able to participate in these processes like we have with jury duty. And then finally, I think in some ways the most important aspect is having support from and capacity of public servants to be able to deliver this. So having some form of an office that's permanently in charge of deliberative processes, whether that's a separate entity or already part of either open government or participation offices, these already exist in some ways, but where there is funding from that authority, that it's arm's length, so it's not biased, but that there's professional staffing within it that can ensure that quality standards are being met, that advice can be provided, and so on. So I will leave it there and will now pass it over to my colleague Ieva to pick up on evaluation.
Thank you very much. So as Claudia has mentioned, we see so many of these ad hoc examples now. We've found close to 600 of them, but also these emerging institutionalized deliberative processes. And we've really noticed and we've heard from the community of practitioners and policymakers and academics the need to actually learn from all of these processes that are happening all over the world and make sure that we're building on these learnings of what went well, what didn't go well, iterating and developing the best processes possible. So based on this premise and on the existing OECD good practice principles, we've developed these evaluation guidelines for representative deliberative process that aim to be sort of a starting point of encouraging this evaluation practice and providing tools from both practitioners, evaluators, and policymakers to develop quality evaluations. So just to say that this is sort of a first document of such kind, and so we are very much open to feedback from the community who are actually using the guidelines, implementing the guidelines, and open to revisiting them and adjusting them to make sure that they are like the best possible tool for everyone to use. So the guidelines, sorry, could we still go back for a second? Establish minimum evaluation standards, and our aim is to also gather comparable data across the field to be able to make more informed insights about deliberative processes, as well as to promote the increased uptake of evaluation activities. Next slide, please. So the guidelines were developed through such a process where first we compared existing evaluation frameworks from different academic sources, but also practitioners. And then it underwent an iterative drafting process with the OECD advisory group of evaluating deliberative processes. And Nicole Curato is one of the members of the advisory group. And I saw that Ricky Dean is also here, and maybe some other members of our advisory group are present today. And then collaboratively with the Democracy R&D Network, we developed the evaluation questionnaires at the end of this document. So the questionnaires for the members of a deliberative process and for the organizers. And we also received feedback from the OECD Innovative Citizen Participation Network, and then the document was approved by the OECD Working Party on Open Government. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Claudia.
Is Claudia still there?
It looks like maybe she has disappeared. So, okay, I will just share my own slides just to pick up where she has disappeared. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so the guidelines are structured in 3 parts. The first part is all about setting up for evaluation, why evaluate, who and how. And then the second part goes over the evaluation framework proposed, the main criteria and different measurement methods to measure these criteria. And then the third part opens up the discussion a little bit further on building on the minimum criteria in these guidelines. So the way that we define evaluation in the context of these guidelines is the structured and objective assessment of the design, implementation, and results of a one-off or institutionalized representative deliberative process. So it refers rather to ex-post evaluation in a broader sense, rather to an ex-ante evaluation, which would mean assessing whether a deliberative process should take part in the first place. And so from the data we've gathered before, we could see that the main method that was used to actually evaluate deliberative processes to date was a participant exit survey, and academic analysis as well as independent evaluations were quite scarce. So these guidelines suggest independent evaluations as the most comprehensive and reliable way to evaluate a representative deliberative process. However, they still acknowledge that for smaller scale, shorter, maybe local deliberative processes, that this might not be feasible. So self-reporting by organizers or members is also an opportunity for learning. The guidelines also introduce 5 principles of evaluation that are designed to help guide the evaluation process and ensure its quality and integrity. So I'm not going to go in detail into all of them, but if needed, we can also go back to them during the discussion. And so the main contribution of these guidelines is the 3-step evaluation cycle proposed for evaluation of deliberative process. And so the first step is the process design integrity, evaluating the way the deliberative process was set up, the representativeness of the group, how open was the process of designing a deliberative process and framing of the question. The second element is evaluating the deliberative experience, so in the room and outside the room, and how the process unfolds, so such as the quality of discussions, equality of opportunities to speak, etc. And the third element is pathways to impact, so evaluating influential conclusions and or actions of a deliberative process, so the response to evaluations and whether it was made sure that there is an impact on the policymaking. And here I have put up all of these criteria that we identify as key for evaluating each of the elements, each of the steps of the cycle. So just for a quick overview, so the process design integrity is all about the purpose, its clarity, suitability, and the fact that it's unbiased, the design that is actually set up to address the question, procedural design, involvement of relevant stakeholders, transparency, and representativeness of the final group of members that take part in a deliberative process. Then the deliberative experience is all about neutrality, inclusivity of facilitation, and then the use of online tools that are accessible, neutral, etc. The quality of judgment and the deliberations that actually happen, and then also the perceived knowledge gains that take part, that happen too. And then finally, the pathways to impact, about influential recommendations and response and follow-up, as well as the member aftercare of people who took part in a deliberative process. So the guidelines also detail this criteria a little bit further. And so we then propose different measurement methods to evaluate each of these criteria, to measure this criteria, such as observation, public survey, member survey, document review, policy analysis, organizer expert witness survey, open-ended interviews and media coverage review. Then the document also includes the 2 questionnaires for members, one for members and one for the organizers. And so these questionnaires were also designed in collaboration with Democracy R&D and with the advisory group, and are now also being piloted in several different deliberative processes. And we've also aimed to design them as unleading, as unbiased as possible. And they are also detailed in the order of the criteria presented in this to facilitate the ease of use of these processes. So we're also very much looking forward to hearing anyone's feedback who are going of those who are going to potentially use these questions. And then finally, the guidelines open up the discussion to longer term and wider effects. Only just scratches the surface because the scope of these guidelines did not allow to go further in these, but we just mention potential effects on the public and the ways that deliberative process can empower members of the deliberative processes, effects on public officials, bodies, civil society organizations, and political strategy. And also in the light of all of these new institutionalized representative deliberative processes taking place, we also introduce the considerations that the evaluation of these processes might have specific criteria included, such as around the agenda setting power that is given to the members, as well as how regularly and coherently these processes are implemented when it's a sequence, and then the opportunities for policymakers to learn from one another and improve their capacity to deliver these processes, as well as if a representative deliberative process that is institutionalized and takes for a longer time, where citizens have a longer mandate, whether there is a retention rate that is sufficiently high and there is rotation among the members. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my slides, and I hope that Claudia could reconnect and join us too. I will pass back the floor to you, Selen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia and Ieva, and also keeping on time. It's exactly 30 minutes you use your time, and thank you very much for the detailed and comprehensive presentations. I would now like to invite our three discussants to say something about this presentation. I'd like to briefly introduce our discussants. We have Melisa Ross with us, who is our first discussant. Melisa is joining us from Berlin. She's a doctoral researcher at the Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences of the Humboldt University and a senior research fellow of the Healthier Democracies Project at Public Agenda in New York. Then we have Dr. J Parry, who is very familiar to many of us. She's our colleague from the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and she also works for the Democratic Society. Lucy's work spans deliberative democracy in theory and practice, and her work with Participedia and Democratic Society seeks to forge stronger connections between academia and democratic practice. She is also a member of one of the members of our project team, the Deliberative Integrity team. Finally, we are very happy to see Matt Ryan with us tonight. Matt is an Australia-based senior fellow at the GovLab, New York University, and adjunct academic at Flinders University, researching innovative public engagement. Welcome, Melisa, Lucy, and Matt. I'm going to invite each of you now to share your comments, maximum for 5 minutes, starting with Melisa. Over to you, Melisa.
Thank you very much, Selen. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I also want to thank the OECD team for putting these documents out there. And I will start my comments by saying that the evaluation guidelines and the forms of institutionalization deliberation make two significant contributions from the perspective of early career scholars such as myself. First, they catalog practices, conditions, and traits of good deliberation in a way that reflects and condenses what is already consensus among scholars and practitioners. So I want to highlight at this stage that having this knowledge systematized levels the field and accessibility of this rapidly expanding field to junior scholars who might be just starting off studying this kind of processes. And the second contribution that I want to highlight is that these guidelines document a minimal framework that also creates an overview of design and analytical standards. So while based on successful cases and on empirical evidence, this can also allow for comparability across assessments in the longer run. So these are 2 points that I think are really important. But in my role as discussant, I also have to speak about other stuff. So I wanna stop at 2 points, 2 questions that popped up in my mind while I was reading through these documents. The first of these points has to do with how these guidelines will most likely travel and how they can be applied under highly uneven conditions. So the documents contain normative standards that have emerged from practices implemented mostly and most frequently in resource-rich countries. So they set very high bar in terms of design and quality standards, but public officials, for instance, in charge of instituting deliberative processes can work under very different institutional environments with varying degrees of access to resources, capabilities. And this is even so in the so-called developed world, or even so across OECD countries. So I was wondering, how can we think about adapting those principles of practices to more modest settings where public officials might maybe be constrained in terms of the resources and capacity they have to comply, and would therefore be assessed more negatively than countries where more resources are available? And this applies already to some OECD members, such as Latin American countries or maybe South European countries. But then there's also the question about the legitimacy and authority that comes associated with these guidelines being produced by an institution such as the OECD. This document will most certainly travel well beyond the OECD members. And we already see this with the visibility that the Deliberative Wave report has had in the past year or so. but I found there was little reflection on the normative power that these documents can have and how these principles can operate in contexts other than the global north. And I think this is something that we as researchers need maybe to continue to reflect on. And then the second point I wanted to raise is related to the still largely unanswered question of measuring embeddedness and impact of deliberation on representative democracies, or even first and foremost defining what that impact is or what it can be. I really liked that the documents employ the term of pathways to impact, that they recognize that it's a long run and some of these measurements can only assess the very first steps towards that. And I think in those terms, these documents share the struggles that also other maybe databases and research projects have had so far. For instance, at the Latino project, we really struggle with measuring impact without in-depth studies of each specific case. So we relied on more formal variables such as producing output and whether that output had reception or not in the government. While Participedia, for instance, relies on more like argumentative and narrative constructions based on specific scientific evaluations. So to me, what stands out from these multiple efforts to understand and measure impact is that we rely highly on government response and institutionalization as main indicators for success. But while reading, I was wondering, when implementing deliberation, do we strive for permanence or do we strive for sustainability? And to which extent is institutionalization just not an indicator for permanence? And is permanence in itself an indicator of impact and of success within representative deliberative democracies? So how do we as researchers, as deliberative democrats, account for or come to terms with the natural life of political processes? How do we account for impact beyond institutional structures? So I want to conclude with a final remark, which is sustainability of participation, of deliberation does not and cannot rely exclusively on government initiative and on government reception. And maybe we need to start looking as well at deliberative processes as part of larger systems, an ecosystem where they coexist, they emerge, and they die out as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melisa, for those excellent comments. Lucy, over to you.
Excellent. And thanks, Melisa, for your comments as well. And I think there's some similarity in there in how we've been approaching this. I'll just preface my comments by saying a little bit about the kind of thing we're thinking about in our project on deliberative integrity. So we're looking at the integrity and ethics of deliberative processes. And some of the questions we're asking is, what does it mean to run an ethical deliberative process? And how can we assess and uphold that integrity and ethics in deliberative practice? And also, what's the relationship between evaluation and integrity? So I was reading the documents with this lens, and my questions kind of relate to that. So my first thought was about the when of evaluation. And I really like that the guidelines recognize the contributions of the different type of actors involved in evaluation: organizers, participants, stakeholders, decision makers, independent evaluations, and that they all bring something worthwhile to the table and have different insights. And one of the themes that's emerging from our research at the moment is that a lot of the ethical issues can come up a long time before, participants ever enter the room. I'm sure this is familiar to most of you. So issues around the process design integrity, as you call it, things like the initial rationale, the intention, transparency around even the decision to convene the process in the first place. And as Ieva mentioned, the guidelines put forward some methods for evaluating these. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do you envisage or have you thought about a way in which these potential ethical challenges can be not only evaluated post hoc, but monitored in real time? Would there be an opportunity to try and kind of write things if they're about to go wrong or before they go wrong? And what might that look like? Is that possible? So it's just an open question. The second thought I had was about who evaluates. So you talk about independent evaluations, external evaluations, and also the role of academics and academic institutions who are often interested in partnering and are well placed to provide credible and independent evaluations. Now, I don't want to say that that's not possible in any way. I just wanted to point out, and again, it's something that's coming out of our research and something that I've personally spent quite a lot of time thinking about, is that I do feel that there's a kind of an awkwardness and tension that academics also face when it comes to publicly criticizing deliberative processes. And I think this has already been discussed in some of the literature, so I'm certainly not the first person to say this. And I kind of would like to raise that just as a point for discussion. I'd just be interested to hear what people think about that, because I think it's an important point. And then my last question is very similar to Melisa's point about the wider and longer term impacts. And I love that chapter 3 of the guidelines kind of opens up this conversation about those impacts. I think it's a welcome and much needed consideration in our field. And it's also a topic that I've studied and struggled to kind of crystallize some of those longer term and wider impacts, because they can beyond the policy impact, and even within the policy impact, they can be so kind of diffuse and discursive and quite elusive to study. So 2 points on that. The first is simply a question, as Melisa put forward. Do you or anybody else have any kind of methodological inspiration for how we can study longer and wider term impacts, or how to track some of those pathways? I would love to hear about that. And secondly, I noticed that in that section, it only seemed to list positive impacts about like increasing public trust and things like that. And I just wanted to raise the fact that there can be negative longer term impacts from deliberative processes if things don't go very well, or things can go wrong. So I wouldn't want to only be looking for the positive impacts or their negation in the long term, but also be alive to the potential negative impacts of things going wrong in some way, because as Claudia also mentioned, it's really important that we look to what goes wrong as well as what goes well, because there's lots of important lessons in there for us. And I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for your comments, which are excellent as well. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Selene. And thanks, my thanks as well to our host organisations tonight. I just want to briefly acknowledge coming to you from Adelaide in South Australia, which is Kaurna land, the land of the Kaurna people, the Aboriginal people here. And always a good opportunity. I like these opportunities to talk a little bit about my home state of South Australia, which in its own way has a very sort of proud history of democratic innovation and democratic reform, being the first place in the world where women had the right to stand for parliament, and just the second place in the world where all women had the right to vote. It was those New Zealanders who beat us just by a few weeks, if I recollect properly. And so there's sort of right through our history, from the moment of settlement, is sort of woven this sort of story of democratic reform and innovation that sort of springs up and from time to time. Today, just so people have got a picture of South Australia, a very general one, we're a small state in terms of population. We're about 1.8 million, with 1.4 million concentrated in the capital city. And by land mass, though, we're actually quite large. We're about 5 times the size of the United Kingdom in terms of land mass, just to give you a rough picture. Today, I'm not going to try and give you the academic perspective. I used to be a Deputy Chief of Staff to the Premier of South Australia, Jay Weatherall. So I'm going to try and give you the political office perspective and a little bit of what it felt like and the questions that kind of arose for us and for me in reflecting on both the OECD's work in relation to the experiences we had here in South Australia. Just some basic facts to begin with. Between 2013 and 2016, the South Australian government here ran 6 mini publics on the topics of alcohol-fueled violence, water management, cycling safety, dog and cat management, and then 2 on the process most people will have heard of, and that's related to whether or not we should establish a high-level nuclear waste storage facility, or dump, to call it, to be blunt, that would basically take all of the world's toxic waste, nuclear waste, and sort of put it in our state. An industry that was said to create, estimated to create about $100 billion worth of value for the state. These mini publics that we ran sat within a broader context of a wider citizen engagement agenda that included participatory budgeting, prize-backed challenges, online and digital engagements, and also sort of, I think the sort of the concept in the academic literature would be sort of deliberative rhetoric, sort of the approach that the Premier took to public debate that sort of distinguished him from his predecessor, to try and engage the public in a discussion about choices and compromises in terms of public policy, instead of thinking that we could have everything. And there's really 2 tales you can tell about the story of South Australia's experience. One is it was very successful, and that's true. We did some formal evaluations of our citizens' juries. That's what our mini public processes were. We got the sort of conventional feedback you get around a lot of these deliberative processes, and we heard some of it again tonight. Citizens engaged in civil but critical discussion with each other, with stakeholders. They became less trusting of dramatised mass media, and interestingly, much more trusting of politicians and government. The people who had that sort of close contact with this process, and particularly with the Premier, had a sense that this was genuine, this was real, this was authentic. And just the fact they had to grapple with the compromises themselves, right? They got a real sense of the challenges that were involved in governing. So those sort of effects that Claudia was talking about, I think it was about sort of self-efficacy and things, that those sort of things really, and in equipping people, the educative role, I guess, around citizenship is a lesson that we got out of our experience here. In overt political terms too, it was observed here to help Jay Weatherill as the first to win the role of Premier in the state, and then to win an unlikely election victory in 2014. So there's sort of an interesting kind of political effect here as well. And on the other hand though, there were some challenges with using mini publics. Our very first citizens jury, we recruited onto the jury the opposition leader, so our direct political counterpart, the opposition leader's communications director, and that was quite an embarrassment for the government, 6 months out from a state election, and caused some awkward moments, as you might imagine, in the Premier's offices, and in some difficult questions from journalists as well. In another way, it showed the integrity of the selection process, because we certainly wouldn't have chosen him if we were handpicking people. Later on, we had a similar problem with one of our largest nuclear citizens jury, which recruited about 340 people, where what was seen to happen was people who weren't sort of particularly concerned about the issue and happy to let it roll along didn't self-select themselves into the process, but activists who were genuinely against it and wanted to stop the process did select themselves in. And so there was seen to be a real disconnect. This is the view of politicians here, a real disconnect between where the public polling that was done and shared with members of that very large jury and shared publicly showed where the public sentiment was at, and where the final sort of choice came down and the final recommendation came down, which was about 60-40 not to proceed with establishing a nuclear waste dump. And again, that was sort of, something that was kind of embarrassing for the government that had put this on the agenda. It really dampened enthusiasm for the deliberative democracy, I have to say, in this state. And there hasn't been another significant process since then, and certainly since a change of government in 2018 from a sort of a slightly left to a slightly right government, there hasn't been any other significant deliberative process here. So it's sort of a tale of the deliberative democracy tale here is really 2 different ones. And so for me, it sort of leaves politicians thinking that, yes, there might be some reward in deliberative processes, but they're high risk as well. And so it comes back to me to those points that some people have touched on tonight around sustainable political commitment and how do you generate that? And what are the sort of wider things you might evaluate? And the questions that come up for me are things about how might the specific choice of institutionalisation of a deliberative process reduce risks for politicians? And you could look at you know, should things be only run out of the executive as one way of controlling risk, or do you sort of share risk and reward and convene things only through parliaments? They might be the two extremes. And should we be evaluating and trying to be politically neutral, or should we be trying to leverage the politics and incentivize the politics, incentivize our politicians to use deliberative methods pointing to the potential political benefits that can result? Can we tread that line between the ideal of deliberative democracy and some sort of purely populist kind of turning into some sort of purely populist instrument? So they're the things that occurred to me, and I was really interested to see the sort of the OECD material start to reference this around altering political strategy. They're the things that I think would be of interest for sustaining the political commitment moving forward.
Great, thank you very much, Matt, for your comments and for sharing some insights from the practice. Very valuable. I would now like to open the floor to questions from anybody who would like to ask a question or comment. I'm just going to change my view to be able to see your virtual hands. And if you could please briefly introduce yourself before asking your question, as we used to do in good old in-person conferences, that would be good as well. Starting with Jens Nevik.
Yeah, thank you. Jens is good. So my name is Jens Nevik. I'm professor of governance and sustainability at Leuphana University in Lüneburg in northern Germany. And thanks a lot for this fascinating presentation, also for the very, very thoughtful comments. In our group, we've been researching mostly informal participatory processes, and only recently have come to discover a bit more sort of the deliberative mini-public-like processes. And in fact, we were running a student seminar last summer, and we were trying to access the OECD database already. So that was giving us some inspiration. And my question would be on the data and on the methodology. Unfortunately, I missed the first 5 minutes, so maybe there was already some talk on that, but I'd appreciate sort of some details on kind of what data is there in, and like comparing the guidelines, which are great for comparative research. But I wonder sort of which of these guidelines have already been applied, and kind of what natures of data is there already that people can jump in and do some comparative analysis in, or is it more sort of a guidelines for doing that research that hasn't been done yet? So I wasn't so clear about that, but it's a fascinating project. So great, many thanks for sharing this.
Claudia, or would you like to respond very briefly? And then we can collect maybe 3 questions, and because this question can be, I guess, answered very briefly.
Yeah, sure. Perhaps just a clarification. Are you referring to the evaluation guidelines or to the institutionalization ones, or both?
So that's perhaps the question. So I was assuming that there is a database where there is already like research and data on a lot of mini publics, deliberative processes, but maybe I got it wrong. So maybe that's just a point for clarification.
We have the OECD database, which at the moment has 574 case studies. And so this is publicly available, and I can put the link in the chat right afterwards. And this includes both the institutionalized examples and also the one-off and ad hoc ones. And the criteria to be included in that is that they are processes that are initiated by a public authority. The people are randomly selected and stratified to be broadly representative. And then there's at least 1 full day of deliberation. So that there's a minimum sense of comparability. So this is available and publicly available afterwards. There isn't like a repository of evaluations that have already been conducted, and there isn't a separate database for the institutionalization examples. They're already within the main database, if that clarifies. And Selene, I don't know, are we going to have a chance to come back also in response to the discussants, or is that later?
Yes, I hope so.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I would like to now collect some questions, maybe 3 questions, and then get
Sounds
brief
good.
reactions from you. Thanks, Claudia. So I have on my list Friedel, Paula, and then Brenda in a row, starting with Friedel.
Claire, yes, thank you very much for that presentation. Yeah, so my name is Friedel and I'm an RA in Participedia, and I'm also working with the Deliberative Integrity Project team here in the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. So my question is specifically around the evaluative framework. And so what we've been doing is we've been using the Participedia platform in our research to look at Australian cases of deliberative mini-publics and to inductively gain a sense of what indicators of deliberative integrity are being emphasized in real-life cases. One of the indicators we've found is how well participants understand the deliberative process itself and what is being asked of them, and particularly before deliberation begins, as this can have a significant impact on the quality and integrity of the deliberative process and eventual outcome. So I was wondering if and how this was considered in the development of the evaluative framework, and if so, whether you could expand on how this might be evaluated in the framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Friedel. Paula?
Okay, so I think the report is extremely useful in my mind, in particular to promote the idea of independent evaluation that is so rare in our field. But I recognize the point of Melisa. It should not become extreme, because in many cases, like there is a difference between the institutionalized mini-public, that it's, to my knowledge, quite rare so far, where we need independent evaluation, and all the things we have worked so far for the past basically 20 years that have not been institutionalized, and there were piloting groups. In those, the independent evaluation or is impossible, or it will really kill the process on the beginning, right? In many situations, you're trying to help the people that are working. So more than independent evaluation, you're doing research and development for them, and helping them with dissemination. So that links also to the awkwardness that she was talking about, Lucy was talking about. And so I think, to me, we need to be carefully sending out the message that when it's institutionalized, we need independent evaluation. When it's not, we can also collaborate in a different way. That was the first point. The second point is about the attempt of creating a minimal standard. I think it's really helpful. In Participedia, we tried to do something like that along the years. Then maybe because we didn't have the same, obviously, cloud of OECD, we failed. At the same time, I've been doing this survey for a long time. And when I do it as a consultant, the KPI, the KPI performance indicator are chosen by the people that are paying me or the people that are organizing the process. So the idea of imposing anything on them is often really hard. When you're working with academics, they have a research question in mind, and it might not be on integrity or other situations. So the way that I get out of this is to offer a menu. So I show them really all the possibilities. And so maybe something like a version 2 of this report will be, this is the minimum, but here is a menu of many other questions that have been asked. Also because there are cross-cultural issues and questions that work in some places don't work in others. And so that's, at least in my work, that's what I do. I offer a menu. Then I try to push for a minimum, but it's often hard to enforce a minimum.
Thanks, Paula. And the final question for this round is coming from Brenda. And can you please briefly introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. So I'm Brenda Ogembo. I work with the Senate of the Parliament of Kenya. And one of the things we do is obviously look at public participation and deliberative practices in the Senate. But I think more people here know me when I was doing my PhD at Birmingham, which is how I got into this community. So I'm very interested, in the work that Claudia was presenting about institutionalization, because I think especially in Africa, there's been a huge increment about trying to get deliberative practices institutionalized within government institutions and kind of taking the lead in that. And you find a lot of legislative provisions to actually institutionalize deliberative practices within government processes, whether it's about budgets or in local governments, about financial processes, or just even legislation before different county assemblies or that are being considered by the council, if you will. But one of the things that I find interesting is that at the very end of her slide, she mentions the fact that these institutions should create offices within them that support these processes, that are financed, that staff build the capacity of staff to actually run these if you're going to institutionalize them. And obviously, I know she's referring to OECD countries, but I'd like to hear her thoughts, especially in democracies that are much weaker, such as the ones you find in Africa and other parts of the global South. Because in my own PhD research, it showed that there is a potential for these offices to be used to obscure the deliberative practices. How do you then separate, once they're institutionalized and employed by the institution, that they're going to run deliberative practices that are fair to the public, and that they're able to then obscure the process or interfere with the process, and they're more beholden to their employer or to politicians who have greater clout with them than to the public. And also just to comment, as you get more and more elaborate deliberative practices, and I think this was also stated, this is the second point by one of the discussants, you're moving farther and farther away from actually building or recognizing deliberative practices in the global South as deliberative practices, because they become more and more expensive, they become more and more unattainable for people in the global South, and therefore, I know you talk about minimum standards, but how is there a way to reframe this, or a way to think about deliberative practices that don't involve complex layers and layers of engagement that are unaffordable in most of these institutions, and therefore just leads to the whole thing being thrown out because it becomes unattainable. And so you do the bare minimum, which is just public or town hall assemblies, and they consider them deliberative. And so bringing in the fact that you're going to bring in outsiders to run this, which is actually being considered to try and make it more deliberative, is not actually a solution. It just becomes another way of manipulating that process. I'd like to hear Claudia's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Claudia and Ieva as well, if you like to respond maybe to some of the questions Claudia responds, and then hands over to Ieva. So over to you very briefly.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can take that last question, and then the ones more on evaluation, I'll pass over to Ieva. And actually, I'm really glad that you asked that, Brenda, and it allows me to come back to one of the points that Melisa quite aptly made, and I think also even to me, Nivek picks up in a question in the chat as well, in terms of the sense of how do we, there's a general sense of how do we adapt this perhaps to more modest settings, or to non-OECD countries as well. And I think this goes to a kind of more fundamental and a deeper question about how we actually view these processes. And I think that for a long time, and for many people still today, they're viewed as a form of consultation or a form of citizen engagement and so on. And so when we see it that way, it's seen as something that is quite expensive and requires quite a lot of effort and other things. But I think when we reframe it and see it as a new democratic institution, in the same way that we valorize our parliaments and our elections, and the money and the resources and the efforts that we go into really ensuring that those institutions are meeting are up to the task and have the resources they need to be trusted and to do their jobs effectively, then I think it becomes a completely different approach to that question too. Because personally, I'm in that latter camp of wanting to move in the direction of seeing these things this way. We don't ask ourselves, like, well, how do we adapt elections to more modest settings? Like, are we less, you know, is it less important that, you know, everyone sees this fairly? We don't ask ourselves this question. And personally, I'm getting a little bit frustrated that this is a little bit how we ask the questions around deliberative processes in some instances. I think that we should be pushing for high standards, because the standards are what allow the outcome at the end to be actually useful, thoughtful, detailed, rigorous recommendations on the one hand, and on the other hand, for the process to be done in such a way that it gets trusted by the wider public. And there can be faith both in the recommendations, but also in the process itself and the people. And when we lower the standards, we reduce both of those things really being possible. So I would kind of come back and perhaps challenge that framing and wonder what others in this conversation here today think about this, because it's something that really is increasingly on my mind. And I think that the longer that we keep seeing this just as like a form of consultation, you know, those arguments kind of keep coming back up. But we're at a stage in my view of kind of moving beyond that. And I think that touches on one of the questions raised earlier about how we even measure or valorize the impact and the success of this. And it's not just about, you know, the number of recommendations that policymakers take up, but I think in the longer term, it's also about, has there been genuine power that has shifted to people? And so I think we get into a territory of starting to ask ourselves, like, are we moving to situations where these recommendations can be binding? What are the accountability mechanisms around them? And then beyond that, I think we also, I mean, Ieva touched on this in the part about evaluation, but and I think Rima mentioned it in the chat as well. I think we also need to valorize a lot more the impact in terms of the civic and democratic dividend of the people participating, and also the wider public when we communicate well about these processes and people are learning. And there's this like transformative impact, because this is not to be undervalued as well. And I think the potential of these processes and the potential of institutionalization really comes from the ability of them to transform people's perceptions of themselves as capable, worthy actors with dignity who have just as much of a role to play in collective decision making. And by extension, that changes their perceptions of others as well. And when we multiply that impact, that's also when we start to have change really happening. So anyways, I will leave it there, and I'll let Ieva come back on some of the more specific evaluation questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of these very interesting reflections and very good questions. I don't know if I'll have the time to get back on all of them, but some of them that I found that kind of were repeated. It's the sort of concern that maybe the standard, or that the minimum standard that we propose here is rather quite ambitious. And I mean, we do recognize that, but the idea of these guidelines is to also provide the tools that if you can only do one thing to evaluate, then you can just do the evaluation questionnaire for the members of the deliberative process that we have developed and that we provide in the annex, which is already there, ready to use. It's already kind of a good start. So definitely there's not always a possibility or even a need to conduct like a full-on independent evaluation if it's like a smaller, shorter, more local process. Definitely acknowledge that these independent full-scale evaluations are most helpful for the institutionalized processes, for the very big scale processes or very high stake processes, to sort of boost and ensure their legitimacy, and to also encourage and reassure the stakeholders and let's say all of the political parties and the public to have confidence in the recommendations that they produce. And also they're helpful maybe to evaluate more cumulative impact of these deliberative processes if there's more than one happening or there's a specific program. So definitely that's the case. But we also wanted to sort of outline the well, as you mentioned, the normative sort of ideal standard for it to sort of have some sort of a horizon that could be aimed for, but that's definitely not the only way forward. So that's why the very detailed questionnaires at the end as a tool to use as a minimum if there's not a lot of resources actually to be dedicated for evaluation. Okay, let me go to some of the other questions. Yes, I wanted to highlight that actually in our discussions with the advisory group about the evaluation guidelines, we also were very conscious of this sort of normative impact of this document, and where we were thinking how these criteria that we distinguish are going to shape then the design processes of some of the deliberative processes in the future. So just to see that we did not really want to be very prescriptive, so we were quite careful the way that we framed things, and we tried to really just build on the good practice principles and not to close up, let's say, the opportunities to experiment with deliberation, to have, you know, to still have the innovation in the field going on, and all of those things were very much in our consideration. In terms of the more specific question from Lucy, that was quite interesting, I found, about the ethical issues that arise in the design process of a deliberative process. That's, I think it's interesting, and we mentioned some of our criteria that, well, it's important to have some kind of code of conduct or some kind of protocol or some rules that actually govern the process. And I think this could be used to monitor these ethical concerns as they arise, and maybe for the bigger processes, the oversight groups can be set up to sort of make sure that these ethical issues are resolved before they go out of hand, in my opinion. And then in terms of the question about the neutrality, and should we be promoting deliberation in the evaluation, or should we be rather critical? We also had these discussions with the advisory group, and we sort of came up with in an agreement that we should include a principle of constructiveness to encourage the evaluators not to question whether a deliberative process was, you know, not to focus on whether it should have been done in the first place, but to actually focus on the content and on the quality of deliberation that happened, not to discourage deliberative processes to be initiated by the policymakers, so not to take too much of a aggressive approach towards the evaluation, not to discourage the practice in general. So that's why we included the constructiveness principle, to still help maintain a little bit of that balance towards as well the encouragement and support for those implementing such processes now that they're still at their sort of starting point.
Thank you. Yeah, is it okay if I cut you there, or?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we have around 12 minutes left, and I wonder if there are any other questions or comments on the things that discussants said as well. I've been looking at the chat. There is a lot going on there as well. For example, Jens shared a framework that they used, and there's a coding framework as well as the database on participatory decision-making processes. And then there are also some pressing questions in the chat. I don't know if people would like to turn their mics on and ask the question. For example, Laurie Moulton Ulrich asks a question about the non-participants and the responsibilities towards them. So what happens to how do the organizers of deliberative mini publics take into consideration the non-participants, the broader public and the public sphere into account, and whether this should not be part of our evaluation as well. And then there are philosophical questions about the need for evaluation, and why do we need to evaluate these processes. And also some emerging theme is really to what extent the evolutionary framework travels to different countries, different cultures, perhaps with less developed institutions of liberal democracy. So the applicability of the framework in other countries and cultures are some of the emerging themes in the chat, as far as I could follow. Is there any other question? Does anybody want to say anything else? I am checking for different pages to see if someone is raising their virtual hand. Okay, so Anna, is this a hand or are you? No.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Yes. 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 Hi.
I just thank you for the meeting, and I learned so much, and it's really impressive how things are so spread right now all over the countries. So we are about
Can you please introduce yourself briefly?
I'm from Israel. I'm right now involved in effort to make this kind of event in a municipal context. And while we are getting ready, we looked at the questionnaire for the participants in order to make one for our event, and it helped us a lot. Thank you for that. Two remarks. One, we found we need some cultural how do you say changes. We had to fit it to our context, the Israeli context. It was not sometimes too much questions about someone want to influence you, who media want to influence you, or all these kind of questions were not so suitable for us. And the other thing is that we found we need to add some question, and this is very important, I think. We add questions about the impact, about trust, about believing that it will make a difference, about sharing the experience with others, and willing to participate in the future in events like that. So these kind of questions we add to the questionnaires, and I think it was very important. I cannot report because the event was not yet done, but after we do it, we can report about the answers we got from the questionnaires.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. And there was one more question from Megan. I don't know if he or she's still here. Probably not. Ah, yes.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm just dialing in from Melbourne, Australia. I actually, Megan Girdler, I'm working with the National Transport Commission in digital communications and engagement. Quite curious about the ethical question that Matt raised around this idea that we could be positioning deliberative processes to politicians as something that's politically beneficial. Because I think a lot of us working sort of in various levels of government, as much as there's innovation that we'd love to try, it sort of needs to be momentum that comes from the top down. So just curious to understand a little bit more about the ethics, because that sounds good in theory, but I know even Nivek was sort of mentioning in the chat there are potentially some less than ideal consequences that may come from that as well. I think Claudia was maybe going to have a chat about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Megan, and thanks, Matt. I mean, I'm happy to come in on this, and I mean, I suppose this is perhaps more a personal view than an official OECD view on this question. So just to clarify that fact, but my take on it is that I feel like the main power and benefit of these processes, or precisely about trying to overcome some of those negative incentives that are kind of part of the design of our electoral democracies, to do with point scoring and winning debates rather than finding common ground, and you know, the divisions between parties and so on, and where these processes help is rather, it's about problem solving and trying to solve those tricky issues where politicians are a bit stuck, rather than trying to instrumentalize these in political ways. So, like, for instance, if I think about the Brussels deliberative committees that was explaining a bit earlier, I met up with Magali Plovy, who's the president of the Francophone Brussels Parliament, who first initiated these, and they've now done three series of these on different issues around 5G, around homelessness, and then around what role can citizens play in communicating, managing, and evaluating crisis situations. And she was saying how the last one of these three worked particularly well because it was an issue where none of the parties actually had an officially defined position on it yet. And so it allowed not only the citizens, but also the politicians to not be deliberating with a party hat on and to be just trying to find the common ground between them on this. And she said it was just like a completely different dynamic, and it in some ways transformed all of the MPs that were part of that committee, and it created the conditions to get out of the usual problems with people kind of needing to hold a party line, or, you know, be defending a certain view because it comes from their party, or they need to win this or that, or whatever. So I personally feel like I feel like we need more of these processes to try and counteract some of those negative aspects of electoral politics and party politics, and feel like it's like I don't know, I'm not being very articulate around this. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's coming through, or if Ieva has something else to add on this, but these were just some of the reflections I had intuitively when you made that point, Matt. And Megan as well, your question following up around it.
Thank you. So we have about 3 minutes. Are there any concluding comments or remarks, comments, reflections from our discussants on what we've been talking about here, from Melisa, Lucy, or Matt? Very brief comments, and then I'll give the microphone back to Claudia and Ieva for them to conclude. And I also want to ask them now, you've been working on so many different cases, you developed a framework for evaluation, you developed some indicators in terms of what works, what doesn't work in deliberative mini-publics, and you also now developed the ethical standards upon which we can assess the integrity of deliberative processes. So I wonder what is next for the OECD. So if you can give us some insights on what you're working on next, and what kind of report we should expect from the OECD on and around deliberative mini-publics, that would be good. But I am re-inviting Matt, Lucy, and Melisa, if you have any brief final comments and remarks.
I can have a very brief comment, just to say that both all of the comments in the chat and from the other discussants, I think I'm getting a really clear picture, and even from Claudia and right at the beginning, there's a real picture emerging for me about not one size fits all. These things can be highly contextual, and different places will find different solutions. So it won't necessarily be the highly sophisticated processes we might find in the global north all the time. And to always be sort of thinking with that very adaptive kind of mindset about these things is going to be really important.
Thanks, Matt. Lucy?
Yeah, nothing really to add. I'm trying to keep up with all the comments and questions in the chat. Just to say that I found the discussion to be really fruitful, and there's lots of things in there which overlap and interrelate closely to our research on ethics and integrity of these processes as well. So it's great to see some kind of common strands emerging there about the ethics. So yeah, I look forward to continuing these conversations in some other format, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Melisa.
Yeah, just to echo what Lucy said, thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Claudia, Ieva, and your team, because I think, I mean, we as discussants, we need to be critical. That's kind of the invitation, but I think you guys have already made the huge step of putting these documents out there. And I think there really are a contribution that is bringing a lot of discussions forward, as we could already see today in the chat and in the exchanges we've had. So I think many of the questions posed here are actually for us, for the researchers who need to then continue moving forward the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melisa. Claudia and Ieva, anything that you would like to add, respond to the discussions, but very briefly, it's over to you, maybe starting with Claudia.
Yeah, thanks, Selen. And I mean, I'm not going to reopen into any of the questions. There's so many more I would have liked to get back to. I just want to really say thank you to Lucy, Melisa, and Matt. Really, your reflections were very thoughtful, and also all of the comments and the questions in the chat and from everyone who attended. It's a very, very stimulating discussion. And thanks, Selen, for moderating and creating the space for this to take place. In terms of what's next at the OECD, we're just going to take a bit of time actually to have these conversations actually around what we've already put out there, and also from these discussions it's emerging what might be useful for the community of what's next. So I think actually all of these questions around impact and how to evaluate it, what does it mean actually, how do we valorize this, to me that's a whole area of questions which are emerging, which I think maybe we'll be doing some work on next, but it's we're very open at this stage of hearing what would be a valuable contribution as well from the community on how we build on this further. So thank you very much for taking the time this morning or this evening for some of you. It's really a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, Claudia. Ieva?
Thank you. Thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you for all of the thoughtful comments and questions. And just want to see that, very happy to see that there's already the uptake of the evaluation guidelines. And if you do use them, please definitely kindly get back to us with any reflections or results of your evaluations, because we really do want to see how they've been used and make sure that we also can revise them and tailor them as the field evolves. So thank you.
Thank you. Nicole, would you like to say anything? Any final remarks from you?
My only final remark is to say thank you everyone for attending, and also watch out for the launch of our Deliberative Integrity website. You'll learn more about our emerging research findings in the coming weeks. I think we are quite ambitious with this project. So thanks everyone. And thank you, Selen, for the excellent moderation as usual.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We had over 120 participants today, so we had to upgrade our center's Zoom account to be able to allow people to join us online. It's lovely to see everybody here today. And I'd like to thank Nicole Curato for designing this event. And also I'd like to thank Bianca Isabella Franco for assisting us with the event organization as well. Hello, Bianca. And thanks to all the speakers and the discussants. And please stay safe. And I hope to see people around, hopefully in face-to-face conferences in near future as well. Thank you. Bye.